So welcome to this Belbin webinar, where we'll be looking at how to use the Belbin reports to raise self-awareness and to increase personal effectiveness. As I've just said, my name's Jo. I'm the managing partner here at Belbin, and we're going to be spending the next 30 minutes going through the Belbin reports and really understanding how you can use that information to help individuals be the best they possibly can be. Now, if you've got your own reports with you right now, that would be great because you could go through at the same time. Otherwise, write copious notes. This is being recorded, so you have got this as a backup. Okay, so let's start here. Let's start at the beginning. So this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at how to use those individual Belbin reports, the ones that you find, the ones that you have once you've completed the self-perception inventory and the observer assessments. Before we start going through the reports, I think it's quite interesting and quite useful if we start looking at why self-awareness is so important in the first place. And of course, there's been so much written, so much research about this. So let's just start with some pointers here. Why self-awareness? So I've taken this from a great article from HBR called Self-Awareness Really, what self-awareness really is and how to cultivate it. The link's there. I'll put it in the email we send out tomorrow too. And the research is really clear. It says, if you are more self-aware, if you have more understanding about yourself, you are more confident, you make better decisions, you communicate more effectively. This research says you're better workers, you get more promotions. My goodness, that's a good enough reason, isn't it? And we're also more self-effective leaders with more satisfied employees and more profitable companies. So there's plenty of reasons there, and there's so much research as to why self-awareness is so important. At Belbin, we carried out a customer survey, and 99% of our customers said actually that Belbin does help individuals develop a greater level of self-understanding, a greater level of self-awareness. And I could stop this webinar right here and say, because we said so, but I think that would be a little bit unfair. So now we've looked at self-awareness, let's start looking at those reports. So where do we start? We start at the very beginning by asking somebody or finding out how somebody sees their own strengths and weaknesses. So this first page of the report is the starting point, and then we're going to take them by the hand through the other pages. But here is purely based on how an individual sees themselves in terms of those 9 key team roles, those 9 Belbin team role behaviours. Now, what we do is we look at the way in which you answer the questionnaire, and there's lots of algorithms and calculations in the background. And what we do then is put them into percentiles. So what we're looking here is percentile scores. And the percentiles here are on a norm database of around about 180,000 people. So a real difference here between the older reports and the newer reports is that the norm databases are just phenomenally high. And what you can see here is people have preferred roles. They're on the right-hand side, manageable roles and least preferred roles. And in this case for Ali, from your own perspective, we're saying here, you see yourself, you see your strengths as implementer and completer finisher. This means that you're task focused and interested not only in getting the work done, but in achieving those really, really high standards. I need to work with Ali. But when you're feeding the report back, it's not just about talking through what's on that page, it's also about asking questions. And one of the key things here right at the very beginning is to find out whether or not that individual, whether or not Ali in this case, agrees with what's in front of them. What is the level of agreement? So asking those questions, do you agree with this? Can you think of some examples when you played these particular roles? Now, of course, your explanation of the roles is critical here as well, which is why it's always really good to really have a really good understanding of Belbin itself. Now, as you can see here with Ali, those roles seem to be grouped around that manageable area. There's no real distinctive preferred, no really distinctive least preferred. So it could be that you ask Ali questions such as, do you find yourself changing your behaviour for a multitude of reasons? Do you find you haven't quite found your, I don't know, that your flow yet? Do you not really found where your main contribution is? Have those conversations right now. Sometimes we find that people complete the questionnaire not with the truthful, this is where I think my contributions are, but where they think they may be, where they think perhaps they should be, which is an interesting one, isn't it? They think, well, actually, I've just joined this organisation and I see everybody's kind of like this, so that's how I've answered the questionnaire. It's at this stage you really need to try and elicit some responses there. I'll just give you a different report here. So we're moving through Ali. This one's going to be John. And as you can see with John's, it's far more distinctive, isn't it, this profile? You can really see that those preferred roles there, the resource investigator, the shaper, the implementer, and the least preferred, there's nothing in the manageable. So questions you could ask here, you know, John, you seem to know yourself incredibly well. Why do you think that may be? What have you done in the past? What have you learned in the past that has allowed you to come up with this particular shape of your team or preferences? But this is really just the very beginning of the story, and it's really important we don't just have the whole conversation about how either Ali or John sees themselves, because it's only their perception, it's only their input on them. In Meredith Belbin's second book, Team Roles at Work, which we've got another version coming out very soon because it's been rewritten alongside Victoria has taken a real interest there and has rewritten it with Meredith Belbin, so we're really excited about that. But one thing that he says quite clearly in Team Roles at Work is this, and I'll just leave that up there for a second. Very often when we just feed back reports about just yourself, people go, oh yes, that's really me. Oh, that's so true. And often I know that I respond sometimes, well, are you surprised? Because you filled in the questionnaire about yourself. You're feeding back to yourself what you thought about yourself. So in a way, there shouldn't be too many surprises. However, this is very much a closed system. We need to really understand how others see us as well, because when it comes to being promoted, when it comes to being deployed into a different team, other people are using their perception of you to do that. So wouldn't it be great to be able to know what that perception is, so that you've got a bigger picture, you have a fuller understanding of yourself. And so this is why at Belbin we don't just take for face value how an individual sees themselves, we ask them to get feedback from others. I do like reading around a subject, and I do like this particular study that I mentioned earlier from HBR, and they've got a wonderful visual that I thought I would share with you on this, because I think this puts it really succinctly. And what they're saying is there isn't just one type of self-awareness, there are two types of self-awareness. One is the internal, and the other is the external, how well you understand how others see you. And if you look at these four archetypes here, what we're looking for is the top right, aren't we? We're looking for people who have high external self-awareness and high internal self-awareness. They know who they are and they know what they want to accomplish. What we find is that people who have low external self-awareness and low internal self-awareness, they're people who perhaps are new to the workplace. They don't really know where their strengths are yet. They're right at the very, very beginning of a process. But it might also be that they've just joined a new team or a new organisation. It could just be that they don't quite, something may have changed, which means that they're not quite as aware as they used to be. We then have people who have high internal self-awareness, but low external self-awareness. These people are the ones there that they don't challenge their views of themselves. You know, they've got this self-perpetuating thing going on here, is that they're not getting feedback from others. They're not really understanding their blind spots. And then you have people who are all really conscious of how other people see them, but they're not too sure about themselves and they end up being the pleasers. They're really, really concerned about the way they're coming across to others, as opposed to looking at how that also resonates with themselves, their own values, etc. So what we're looking at is that high external self-awareness and high internal self-awareness. The high internal self-awareness can come from just the SPI, I suppose, and the external is from what we call here at Belbin, those observer assessments. There's asking for feedback from others. I also don't think that self-awareness is something that is done, that is finished, that is ticked off a list. We should continually be checking our levels of self-awareness because things change. In fact, some research says that the longer we are in our careers, the less self-aware we get because we feel that we know it all. We get a little bit arrogant, we're slightly less receptive to the views of others. And that's a shame, isn't it? Self-awareness, this understanding of ourselves, should be something that is constantly ongoing. They also say that as you get higher up the echelons of an organisation, it's also more difficult to seek feedback from other people. And that's because perhaps there's fewer people who are prepared to give you feedback. Perhaps some people are scared, I don't know. But again, so we need to really, really sort out that feedback to ensure that we get it no matter where we are within our careers. So putting a Belbin perspective on this is really what we're doing is we're looking at how you see yourself. Then we're looking at how others see you. Have that time for reflection, and that is where the enhanced self-understanding comes in. So we're now going to be looking at how others see you. And this is where the observer assessments come in. And this is the next page of the Belbin report. So this is how you've seen yourself. What do other people see? So Ali asked 6 people to feedback, and they have seen Ali's top team roles as team worker and implementer. How did they get to that? Well, like I said before, lots of calculations, algorithms, etc. in the background, but each observer has a list of words that they have to tick, and they tick those words that they think really, really apply to you, not just a little bit, but more than the average. And there's a list of words which we call list A words, and they relate to all the strengths of the team roles. And there's also a list of words which we call list B words, which relate to all of the allowable associated weaknesses for that team roles as well. We call them associated weaknesses because they're only really allowed if you've got the associated strength. So here we've got a breakdown of all of the team roles that others are seeing in Ali, and we're seeing how much of that team role was a strength and how much was the associated weakness. What questions do you need to ask here? Well, first of all, you would expect to see stuff on the associated weakness side because we're all human. None of us are Mary Poppins. We all will have them and we all will show them. If we're not showing our weaknesses enough, perhaps we're spending a little bit too much time hiding them. I don't know. But here, again, it's about the questions that you can ask the person. What would you ask Ali here? First of all, would they agree? Can they see why their observers are seeing these types of strengths and weaknesses? Do they agree that the weaknesses do come into play? Can they think of examples as and when they do come into play? I'll show you the next one, because John's is quite interesting. Because what we have is they're definitely seeing that shaper and resource investigator. But as you can see, that shaper bar for those associated weaknesses is getting a little bit pronounced. That's okay. And it's okay unless that bar starts outweighing the strengths. And at that point, the contribution you are making for that particular team role isn't overwhelmingly positive. And therefore, we really need to check that John in this situation understands that. What does John need to do? Well, first of all, it's understanding, isn't it? It's being aware that that is the situation, and other pages will help with that. And it's a case of managing those weaknesses. We don't give you a particular number for that. We say if it's any more, sort of like half or more of the list A, so the strengths. If the associated weaknesses, the list Bs are more than half or more of the strengths, then to start asking those questions to really help that individual understand how they're coming across to others. So we look at how they see themselves, how other people see them, and then what we're looking for is really looking at comparing the self and the observer perceptions. But actually, before I get here, I'm just going to stop sharing a sec. So what I'm going to look at is, I'm not going to look at the chat, but I am just going to put another poll here to see, for those people who use Belbin, I'm just going to ask you a quick question. How many people do you need as a minimum? How many observers do you need as a minimum to create a full Belbin individual report? How many do you need? Okay, have a good think there. Of course, we've got a high percentage of accredited people, you know, quite a lot of things. Okay, I'm going to end there. I'm going to share the results. You're correct. 4 is the minimum that we say you need to get the Belbin report. Actually, not what we said, it's actually what's actually factored in. And that's because you need to have the feedback from more than just the one person. It's more than just the person you work most closely with. We do recommend 6 is a great number. Why is that? Because you can ask perhaps people who work with you, who manage you, who you manage. You can get a real mixture there. But the minimum that you need to be able to create a full Belbin individual report is 4. I think you can go up to something like 20, but one would say, do you really work that closely with 20 people whose feedback you would feel that was useful, that you'd listen to, was fair, etc., etc. But no, it is 4. So well done, everybody. Back to the slides here. So where have we got to? We've looked at the self, and now we're looking at that comparison. And this is a great one for people to really understand and become far more self-aware. So it's looking at the combination of all of the observer feedback, and it's comparing it to the total of your self-perception inventory. So what are you doing here is you're looking for where there are similarities and where there are differences. Now here we have this is new, isn't it? We've actually got some information on the left-hand side. And it says that you see yourself as someone who thrives on process, discipline, hard work and routine, and others agree. So your observers are agreeing with you. However, they're also seeing this team worker, aren't they? They're seeing this ability to adapt, your empathy and your selflessness in doing what is required. But overall, what do your observers agree on? The fact that you can be trusted, you're considerate, and you assist with what needs to be done. So we've got some words to start you off here. But some questions you could ask is, why do you think that there is a difference? Do you see any hidden talents? I like this way of phrasing it. Instead of saying, oh my goodness, nobody else is seeing that, look for areas in which people are seeing it and that individual isn't, because that's really going to help them explore strengths they didn't realize they had. And it's a far more positive way of putting it. So in this case, did you realize that others see your team worker far higher than you? They see this ability, your empathy, your listening skills. Can you think of a situation when that was? If we look at the next one, if we look at John, you can see, crikey, where would you look? I mean, this is a very sort of definite profile, isn't it? So John sees themselves very much as enthusiastic and optimistic. So their top team role they have put is that of resource investigator. Now, their observers, you could say, well, they're in agreement, but actually for that top team role, the observers aren't seeing it. Then, well, they are seeing it, they're still seeing it over the 60th percentile, but they're seeing some different strengths. They're seeing far more of the shaper behaviour than the resource investigator behaviour. Again, it's asking questions. When and why? Who do you think? Which project have you been working on? Etc., etc. Again, what do they all agree on? You're not afraid to say what you think. You have a strong desire to win and flourish when meeting new people. So a couple of shaper statements in there. So again, it's looking at this, looking where the gaps are, looking where the similarities are, and asking those questions. And here, this is now towards the back of the report, but what you can then look at is you can really analyze each observer. And when it comes to self-awareness, understanding how others are seeing you, this is really important. So this page is saying this is your self-perception from 1 to 9. And then these are each of the observers and which team roles they're seeing most of, number 1, least of, number 9. And if they're not seeing any of those team roles at all, it is going to be a blank. So you can see with Ali here that actually most people are seeing most team roles. It's all quite filled in. And there are the similarities. But questions you may want to ask is, why is Erin Blue not seeing your implementer when everybody else does? What relationship do you have with Erin, which means that they're seeing a higher plant behaviour, more creative, rather than the organised and the practical? What relationship do you have here? Who's your manager? Who manages who? Because again, the relationship that you have with people will really, really affect the way in which they see your team role strengths. Don't get too bogged down here, because it's not looking at how much difference there is. It's just giving you a ranked order. Obviously, there could be 1 percentile difference, or there could be 15 percentile difference between them. But this was really giving insights to help there. John Yellow, my goodness. As you can see, people aren't seeing as much of a broad range of team role behaviours. There's areas there which are blank. So they're seeing everything or nothing, so to speak. And you can see that there's real coherence there with the shaper behaviour. Everybody's got the shaper there in the top 2 team roles. But again, you can ask questions about the relationships that everybody has there, why they're not seeing so much. It's very interesting, isn't it, that the observers of John Yellow are very much like John Yellow's self-perception, very, very distinctive, very much definite. This is where you are, this is where you aim. So again, 2 very different reports, aren't they, which will say different things, but both helping with that self-awareness and really finding out about that external self-awareness at this point. The other page that really helps, again, what we're doing at the moment is getting all that data in, aren't we? We're looking at all of the data. We're looking at it from ourselves and from other people. So here we have those observer words. This is for Ali. And these are all the words that could have been ticked as part of the observer assessment. And we're looking here, the words which are in italics are those list B words, which are relating to the weaknesses. Here we have reliable, caring, helpful, efficient, imaginative, hard driving, so on and so forth. Again, it's exploring this. Did you realise that others see you in this way? And when you're looking at those top roles, you really are looking at consensus between those observers. Sometimes it's as useful in that self-awareness to see where people definitely aren't seeing you. There's definitely no words there. So nothing on original there for Ali, but also nothing on confrontational. Unlike John Yellow. So if you remember with John, John's got that really high shaper is coming through. And you can see that from the words that people are using. The outspoken, the competitive. Confrontational is quite high, and that's a list B word. Outgoing, methodical, impatient, challenging, inquisitive. So we're really seeing from an external point of view here, that really, really high shaper RI behaviour. Now, this is going to be interesting for later on, because like I said, this is all about data. This is about the self-awareness, but how do we use this to become more effective? And that is where the other pages come in. Okay. So this is a page that when you are looking to raise self-awareness for yourself or anybody else, this is the first page that really says, so what? What does all this mean? And this really is looking at your top 2 or 3 team roles, looking at your bottom team roles and saying how this information can be used when you are working with others, when you manage others, when you are the manager. So very much a go and get a cup of tea, go and have a real good read page. But this is the first page that really does say, what does all this data mean? How can we use it? You've got Ali's here, and then you have John's. This is the place where you get that overall profile. This is the overall graph that some of you may be aware of having on the first page. We've now brought it here to make it relevant to the information that's being given. You can see very distinctive profile there for John. You can see here with Ali, you've got those 2, maybe 3 really strong contributions, but the rest are very much sort of equal, aren't they? So this page, the placement suggestions, is really where we start talking about the effectiveness. It's looking at what sort of working environment Ali is best placed in, how to present themselves in that environment, their strengths and their weaknesses. Questions here that you could ask would be along the lines of, does this describe your working environment at the moment? Is this where you're placed? Is this where you find most of your day? If not, what does your work environment look like currently? How do you feel within that? And then again, the strengths, can you think of a time when you use that strength? Let's try and validate them again. Can you think of a time when, or how did you use that? And can you see where your weakness may have caused, not an issue in the past, but where you were aware of it in the past, and what did you do to overcome that? I think this page is a really good one to use as part of a personal development plan when sitting down with the manager, increasing that self-awareness, going, look, I need to be effective, and to be effective, I've found out more about myself. This is where I need to be. You can see John's here, one more weakness, one more trigger points being hit there. Again, working out what kind of environment John should be best suited for. And you use this alongside the next two pages, which I love, which are looking at that as a combination of team roles, because none of us are one team role. We're all a wonderful collection of all of the team roles, just some are higher than others. So here we have for Ali, looking at those combinations. This is the type of work that Ali would be most effective in. So again, sitting down and saying to Ali, if you're in this situation, these are the roles you should be playing. How can you make sure you are effective when you're working within a team? How can you best make these contributions? And again, you have with John the same. What I think is quite interesting here is you've got the exploiting opportunities, which is great. I like to be given responsibility for that. But taking into consideration what the observers were saying about being quite confrontational, is that going to have a bearing on the way in which John does exploit those opportunities? And do we need to do some work there to ensure that that doesn't get in the way of the contributions that John can make? Right. That's a very quick run through of the Belbin reports and how to use them for raising self-awareness. Remember, we have internal self-awareness, we have external self-awareness, we have the self-perception inventory, we have the observer assessments. We have those observer assessments which really do validate ourselves and give us more of an insight into how the rest of the world does see us. Hopefully that's given you an idea of the questions that you can ask. There's far more, by the way. Go through this actual document that we will be sending you tomorrow to download, questions to ask at each stage. Okay, and just remember, but you know this because half of you are accredited, Belbin's not just a theory, it really is a wonderful practical tool. Once you start using these reports, change really, really does happen. So I'm just going to stop sharing screen there. I don't know if I dare open the chat, but Vicky, how has the chat been? Are there any questions or anything that we should be discussing now in the last 10 or so minutes of this webinar?
Yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on in the chat. Quite a lot around observers and whether you should show the names of observers. And lots of people, I think, in the chat pointing out that it can be really useful where someone's behaviour is changing in a particular context, where they're perhaps showing different behaviours with their manager than with those that they manage, for example. So yeah, I think as others have said, useful if you can sort of have that discussion around showing observer names so that people know what to expect. And yeah, it can really add value where you've got lots of discrepancies, especially.
I think it's a really interesting one because we have this debate a lot about the observer names or showing them or not showing them. In our experience, when people have been we are not showing them, we've produced the reports without them on, and then straight after the session, they've been asked to be reproduced with the names on because they've realised the value of them. Because how else do you know how you're coming across two different people? I always use the example of a few years ago when we did our observe, and we do this on a regular basis in the Belbin office, and we try and do it as honestly as possible. But I found that actually I had 4 observers, a bit more, who saw very high shaper resource investigator behaviour. And I have 2 observers who see very high coordinator team worker behaviour. Now, unless I knew who those people were, I wouldn't have known who it was that I was coming across in a different way, or people were seeing different things. It so happened that it was Meredith and Nigel Belbin who saw the team worker coordinator, because I was mainly listening. My goodness, one partners own the company, it's kind of their theory and their reports, and I wanted to learn, you know, I wanted to, how can I help, how can I learn more, so really in that listening capacity. Whereas then going to the office and going, right, we need to get this done now, everybody was seeing those slightly different behaviours, weren't you, Vicky? But unless I knew who it was who was feeding back, I wouldn't have had that insight of how I was being able to change my behaviours in terms of the people whom I was working with.
Yeah, and I think it's important, as I say, just for people to have that expectation managed in terms of what people will and will not be able to see. So I think obviously showing the sample report, which we do when people complete an observer assessment, so they can see, okay, there'll be, you know, the list of team roles, and there's obviously the collated observer words. But I think that is quite important in ensuring that people are able to be quite honest and open with their feedback.
Yeah. No, absolutely, because I think, as David says, to what extent does the lack of, you know, not being anonymous, how does that affect restrict the feedback? I think it's an interesting one, because I think there's a more of a historical question there, isn't it? Because I think we've all been exposed to tools which has had a 360-degree element, which have all been very much I didn't think they're working very well, I didn't think they're very effective, I didn't think they were competent in this. They've been very, you know, some of the tools are, I can't think of the word, not so positive. Whereas with Belbin, it's just ticking words. And I think we have to remember this. We're ticking words that look to the strengths and the weaknesses. And people will be able to see which team roles you've seen, but not which words you've ticked. They will be able to work out that everybody's giving you a double tick. If that top number of ticks is, say, 10, and you had 5 observers, you knew everybody gave you a double tick. That's where the anonymous side of thing goes. But otherwise, they're not, and obviously there's another combination, isn't there, at the top for that. But otherwise, they're only seeing the team roles they see, not the words. But I think, as always, it's just best to know what they're expecting, what a report looks like. Managing expectations is by far the best thing.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
And while we're on sort of talking about SPI and observers, there was another question around how those can vary. And someone was talking in particular about whether we'd say that means someone has low EQ, if there's lots of what we'd call a confused profile. So if the self-perception is quite different to the observers, but maybe also the observers disagree with one another, I think there can be quite a few different reasons for that to happen.
Yeah, you're dropping out a little bit on your sound there, Vicky. But yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I think the key thing is choosing your observers with care. Thinking to the object, what situation do you want your observers to be observing you in is really, really important. Many years ago, decades now I can say, I used to work in a sales role in the pharmaceutical industry, and I did a similar tool which I had to get feedback from everybody, and I got feedback from the doctors I was selling to, the rest of my team, head office and everything else. And I was very different to everybody because I was playing a different role. I had a different relationship with them. And in fact, that was quite important because it showed that I could change depending on whom it was I was speaking to. But how useful is that? Otherwise, I'm not sure, but it's really important to understand the context of your observers. If you work at board level, do you want the rest of the board to observe you? Do you want the people who are working in your particular team, your silo, your department to observe you? Because they may see very different things. So it's really important that this external self-awareness that we get, we understand where it's coming from. And that's why it's really important to ask those questions right at the very beginning. Do you want to be observed by this team, that team, for this project, so on and so forth? It's really important to do that.
Okay. Yeah, and we also had quite a few about other tools. So I don't know if my audience is okay now. So using Belbin alongside other things. And there's lots of different names in there. But I think one good point was around emphasising that Belbin is about behaviour. So it has these two elements, the internal self-awareness and the external, and that when you're looking at other psychometrics and personality tests, you don't necessarily have both of those elements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just looking, actually, I can probably share my screen here very quickly. So what we're looking at, so always a delay, isn't there? So impatient. So when we're looking at Belbin, we are looking at measuring the behaviour, the what we do, not the who we are, of which personality, where the other tools tend to be, feed into our behaviour. There's always other elements as well. So you've got your mental abilities, your IQ, your EQ, what gets you up in the morning, your values and motivations, your experiences of different teams, organisations, cultures, external influences. Are you working from home? The whole COVID situation there, and also as we learn about these team roles and the roles in which they play, these all feed in to our behaviour. So linking it with other tools. So for example, MBTI is a personality tool. It's looking at who I am. It's looking at the dichotomies, isn't it, between introversion, extroversion, etc., etc. That is based there with the personality, but that may not be how I actually behave in the workplace. So this is a continuation of that journey, I suppose, is one way of putting it. I'll just stop sharing there. Okay. Any other questions at all? Anything in the Q&A that we should take a look at?
I think we probably covered that in terms of the observer names being printed in the report. That was, I think we covered live. There was one more around remote working and knowing people well enough to ask for observations.
That's a really good question. So whether or not people know you well enough when you've been working remotely to be able to observe. People can still observe some behaviour, but I don't think they are seeing as much of you when you are working with them, when you're working on Zoom. I think perhaps if you are using the observer assessments, it may be, this is just my personal opinion here, I think it is worth waiting till we get back to more of the hybrid working, or perhaps seeing people on a more ongoing basis to get a fuller picture. But I still think you'd get a good snapshot. We've done plenty of research. Team roles do come across differently, or very distinctly, sorry, on Zoom when you see people. As you can see, my resource investigator behaviour is coming through quite a lot now. So you can still see it, but yeah, I will admit it is more difficult. It is more difficult. Okay.
I think lastly, there's lots of people, and there's lots of excitement, which is nice as well. People asking about getting hold of new reports.
Yes.
And timelines.
Absolutely. New reports and timelines. They are available. We're rolling them out very slowly, just to make sure that everything works okay. There's nothing worse, is there, than launching everything all at once and it not doing what they need to do. So if you do want to start using the new reports, please contact us. I know a few of you already have. We may not have got back to you. We do apologise, but they are there. You can't convert an old report into a new style because we've changed quite a lot, not just the norm database, but calculations and various other things as well. So you have to start right from the very beginning with that, but we'll give you more information about that at a later date. Okay. Belbin can help individuals with their self-awareness, understanding both how they see themselves and how others see them, which really feeds into making people more effective, or helping to increase personal effectiveness. You start by finding out about yourself. You've asked feedback from those observers to get the report that can really start these conversations. And remembering, of course, that self-awareness isn't something that's done, isn't something on a tick list. It's something that we need to go through constantly and keep addressing as we go through our working life to ensure that we can be as effective as we possibly can be. Thank you for joining us today. Any other questions, please do get back to us. It's team@belbin.com. We'll be sending out the recording tomorrow, but thank you very, very much for joining us, and we'll see you again at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.